everyone. I'm Natalie Shurtleff. I'm the Associate State Director for Advocacy and Outreach for AARP Connecticut. So, welcome again to another episode of Coffee and Tea with AARP, our biweekly interview series where we talk about the issues important to the 50 plus here in Connecticut and their families. So, today I'm here with AARP volunteer Margaret Lewis and Representative Tracy Marra, who represents Darien and Norwalk. So before we get into our questions with Representative Marra, I would like to give Margaret a chance to say a few words about herself and what she does with AARP.
Thank you. Good morning, Representative Marra and Natalie. It's so good to be here. Again, I'm Margaret Lewis. I'm 66 years old. I live in Stratford, Connecticut with my husband of 45 years and a little dog named Luna. She's a multi-poo. We are very comfortable living in this area, but as everyone knows, Connecticut is expensive to live in. And watching the rising cost of prescription drugs is very important to me and to the other members of AARP. I had worked as a marketing executive for 35 years in Westport, and I was senior vice president as well as a senior partner of the agency until I had a stroke, 2 strokes actually, and they were devastating. I lost my job as a result, and the prescriptions that I need to keep me going are extremely expensive. And we're very lucky to have good insurance, but there are many people here are my age that are not as fortunate to have good insurance. So we really, really want to help those people out. My role with AARP is to be both an advocate as well as a caregiver. So they're fulfilling roles to me, and I enjoy them greatly. And I hope I can continue to do that for a long time. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Margaret, and thank you for sharing a little bit about why this is so important to you. We really appreciate you sharing your story and for everything that you do for AARP. So, Representative Marra, before we really dive into the hard questions, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, thank you, Natalie. Thank you, Margaret. I appreciate being on here and talking with you guys today. I am a state representative. I represent both Norwalk and Darien. This is my second term and my third year in the House. My background is pharmacy, so I find myself in this space very naturally just as a healthcare provider. I actually spend a lot more time in the legislative process in things like energy, where I am a ranking member. But my love and what you bring to the table is your history, your job experience, and pharmacy is there for me. So I always come back and I always am an advocate for healthcare and for access to healthcare. So I was really quite honored when both Senator Lesser and Senator Gordon reached out and asked me to co-chair this prescription drug task force with them, which we started almost a year ago at this point. And it's been an interesting process along the way, and I think we still have a long ways to go, but I'm happy to have this discussion with you guys today, talk about the past and the future.
Margaret, do you want to take the first question?
Yes, certainly. As I said earlier, addressing the high costs of prescription drugs is important to AARP members. And during the last legislative session, we know that you co-chaired the task force on prescription drugs in general and the cost thereof. Can you remind our viewers about what that task force was aiming to do, as you said about your work?
Yeah, so thank you so much. You're right. So many people you talk to are struggling with the cost of healthcare across the board, but prescription drugs particularly are an issue. I think that was the reason that task force came together, is just looking at the increase in those costs of drugs and the struggle that we see, across the board. What we found, and I think moving forward, there's a lot to move off of what we've already done, is there's so many layers to healthcare costs. There's so many layers to prescription drug costs. And I feel like, and it's not transparent in how things are happening behind the scenes. So getting people to the table was very important. And that's one of the things that this task force did. It brought a group of people to the table. So AARP was there, but we had pharmacists. We had pharmacists from all sectors. We had pharma there. We had the health insurers there. We had nurses there. We had doctors there. We had the executive branch, because, as Connecticut has a big role in healthcare. They're a big user of healthcare in the state. And then we had members of the legislative branch, because when you talk about healthcare costs, you actually are bringing in many committees, right? So you've got the General Law Committee, which deals with prescription drugs. You have Public Health Committee. You have Human Services Committee, which deals with Medicaid costs. But then you've also got the Insurance Committee. So it's a lot of minds that have to come together when talking about prescription drugs. And that was, I think, the biggest thing that we did is we brought many mouths to the table to kind of share their size so we can slowly peel back the layers and figure out what we know already about healthcare costs and what we need to know. So, and I'm sure we'll get into the bill a little bit more, but that's where we found ourselves, kind of digging into what we know and what we need to know.
Yeah, I mean that's the perfect segue there. The task force really did bring in so many different voices and different perspectives on the issue, and the end product was some legislation that I think really accomplished a lot. So can you tell us a little bit about what came out of the task force?
Well, I'm really happy you think it accomplished a lot. I think that we still have further to go. I think one of the biggest things that the task force did is I think is going to provide us a little more insight into the future, because a conversation needs to keep moving forward. The task force was aimed at bringing some transparency to what was happening behind the scenes. And I think once we dig into that transparency and what's happening behind the scenes, we might be able to inch forward with future legislation, particularly PBMs. They're the people that everybody loves to hate right now, which is unfortunate. I think looking at the very start of where PBMs came from, and I remember when I was doing my pharmacy rotations and I worked for the HMOs, one of the things that we did is we looked at medications people were on, and we tried to make sure we optimized where the best value would be for them. If there was a drug, for instance, that was going over was going generic, could we move them to a generic drug? If we had a series of drugs that were very similar, was there one that was had a better cost benefit in the long run? So that was one of the things that we really looked at with HMOs, and now it has turned to something bigger and with that lack of transparency. So trying to understand where the PBMs are coming from and what their motives are, I think is important. At the end of the day, we thought that the PBMs needed to act in good faith. So that was one of the things that we added into the bill, that they needed to act in good faith and fair dealing. Looking at the spread pricing with PBM. So this is whether the PBM actually pays the insurer the cost that they have for the drug, or is there a percentage difference? So now understanding the PBMs have to offer the health insurer the same price that they actually receive from the drug. So it's not that here's your price for the drug, and then if the PBM is able to get a better price, that they're not taking the spread price in that. The other thing that it did is looking at the rebates that the PBMs get from pharma. So how do they apply those rebates, and where do those rebates fit in the mix? And so this allows the insurance commission to actually look at those rebates and how they're utilized. And so the insurance commission gets to take a look at the behind the scenes on how the rebates are working and how they're actually applied to the cost of overall healthcare, whether they're actually going to the end user of the healthcare or whether they're going to the health insurer. How exactly are they used? So what this did, I'm hoping, is going to offer a little more transparency into what's going on behind the scenes. So this is not the end story. This is really a start. Like, we just need to lift the hood up a little bit and take a peek and see what's going on. And then I think in the future, we might be able to make some more changes. This was a big bill. So there are a few other things that I thought were very important, that we have good access to prescription drugs. What I'm seeing across the board is squeezing some of the pharmacies out and squeezing pharmacists out. I mean, if you go right now and let's see, what time is it now? Well, if you're listening to this, should be a coffee time, but if you're listening to this during lunchtime, then it's very possible that your local pharmacy is not open right now. And that's something we've seen new, obviously, since COVID, but I think that's a trend that we're seeing, that we are having less pharmacists that actually want to work in retail, because it is so high pressure in that area, because there's that squeeze in price and there's expectations that the pharmacist is on the phone with insurance company or with your doctor to an amount that they're not actually able to spend time with you, and to amount that they're not actually able to serve you during those lunchtime hours. So I think we really need to be careful when we're squeezing healthcare costs, that we're not squeezing out the healthcare providers, right? We need to make sure that our healthcare providers are supported, because at the end of the day, if you're trying to squeeze cost out at the expense of the healthcare provider, you're losing access, right? And we need to make sure that we have access. We know that pharmacists are kind of, many times, and especially when we talk about seniors, they're so used to going in and talking to that trusted provider that's in their neighborhood, that's around the corner, that can give them their flu shot. And if we shut those down, that's a real problem. We need to make sure that we are supporting that. And so looking at the compensation for pharmacists was one of the things that we did. We know that pharmacists go above and beyond, and we've asked them to go above and beyond just dispensing medications by offering flu vaccines, by offering COVID vaccines, by doing HIV tests. And not that this is a focus for this group, but being able to prescribe oral contraceptives as well. And we're not actually compensating them for their work. So one of the things in this bill is actually looking at compensation for pharmacists. The other thing is taking a look at prescription drug shortages. I don't know how many people have shown up to your counter and only to find out that your drug is on back order because there's issues with it. So this takes a look at some of the prescription drug shortages, and it's not a great step forward, but this is a way that the Economic and Community Development Commissioner can actually offer a grant to folks in the industry that are focusing on drug shortages and making sure that we don't have drug shortages here in Connecticut. A controversial piece, and this is something that the executive branch certainly supported, and I really supported, was allowing FDA approved drugs to be purchased from a Canadian wholesaler. So I say this very carefully because people think this is the US purchasing Canadian prescriptions, and that's not what this is. This is Connecticut having a approved set of drugs. Maybe it's something like HIV drugs or something that is more expensive, that they have an approved route to get through an approved Canadian wholesaler. And the drugs have to go through this, what's called in the industry, track and trace. So this would allow track and trace is where the US requires each drug to have been tracked along the way from start to finish, from production to consumption, so that you know exactly where that drug has been. So that has to be worked through in order to allow the US to, or excuse me, it would just be Connecticut to allow going through a Canadian wholesaler. This is something that was put into federal law that is allowed by the Trump administration, and again, doubled down by the Biden administration. So it's had bipartisan support federally. Florida has approved the process. To my last check, they haven't actually imported anything. This is not to say that Canadians really want to sell us any drugs right now. I think they might be a little frustrated with us for good reason. But what this does, and I think everybody should agree, that anytime you increase competition in the market, you can see a benefit to prices. And that's really what we want to do. We want to increase competition and hopes that it benefits the prices. So maybe if some of the pharmaceutical companies see that we're going to try to go through the Canadian route, maybe they will come to the table and offer better prices too. That certainly is my hope.
Thank you, Representative. That was really helpful in understanding what the bill was comprised of. I was at the Capitol with other AARP volunteers the day of the last session, and I know that the passage of this bill went down to the wire. I think it was at midnight that it finally was passed. And so I have to thank you from the bottom of my heart for all the work you do and how hard it was to get that bill passed. What was the biggest lesson that you might have taken away from working to pass the legislation that night? It shouldn't be that you have to work to midnight to do things.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, in all fairness, it was 2 minutes till midnight. That's when the bill passed. Because at midnight we shut off. And look at we have to work together. All voices have to come to the table. I will say one of the lessons that should be learned is keeping a bill pure from start to finish is important. So lots of people would like to take segments of one bill and throw it into another bill. They'd like to have an omnibus bill and they'd like to put stuff in. We had a prescription drug task force bill that was pretty pure. There was something that was added in at the end that was friction for the bill. And that was looking at the generic GLP drugs for weight loss. This would require the DSS commissioner to write a letter to the federal government and asking them to reduce the patent on the drugs. And that's a precedent that we have not taken before. And I think many of my colleagues were frustrated with that. I mean, I understand cost. I understand cost of these drugs and cost of drugs in general are really high, but we respect research and development, and we respect companies that come in and have done tons of research and development. And this is what we've told them that they get when they put that research and development in. They get a patent. This is how the patent works. To have them get to the point where they've got a patent and say, actually, we're going to go back and we're going to change the rules on that, I think is not the way things should work. If we want to change the patent process, we should change it for future drugs, not for ones that are already out there. I don't think we should change rules on people in hindsight. So that was a struggle for many folks on my side of the aisle. The struggle for other people was that we didn't put little things in for them. Like at first, this was supposed to go, they wanted to put this bill through with the insurance committee, and there was going to be extra insurance things in there. But our understanding was that that wasn't going to pass at all in the Senate. So, we really had to beg and plead to say, no, we really think this should go through as a prescription drug task force bill, as it was meant to be. This has been vetted. We've worked really hard on the wording. So that was what a lot of the back and forth was. And at the very end, I was working with my colleagues on that very last section with the patent, which, I mean, they may have had other issues within the bill too, because a lot of times if you're not necessarily working on the bill, once they caucused it up in the Senate, there's just a lot of questions right at the end. So I spent time up in the Senate talking with my colleagues, as did Senator Gordon, walking through each of the steps and letting them understand where we're coming from and why we believe it's important. So relationships with your other legislators is really important, and being able to kind of meet them where they're at and have these like high level conversations without frustration, I think is really important. We had so many of those right at the last minute.
Understood. Is there anything else that we haven't covered in this discussion that you would like to share?
Next steps. I think is important. I don't think that this is the be all end all. I think that we need to see how these rebates happen. When we were putting this bill through, I mean, the state of Connecticut, they have a dog in that fight, right? They're already working on things that they want. And so whether the state of Connecticut has a whatever deal they have for their health insurance, we need to make sure that at the end of the day is not affecting other health insurers. We need to make sure that at the end of the day, the end user is the one that's seeing the benefit. So I think as we peel back the layers of the onion, we're going to see more. So this conversation has not ended. The other thing is we need to push this up at the federal government level. I know I've spoken with my Congressman Jim Himes about, pushing this up that way, and that's something that I will continue to talk with the federal government about. But I hope that this continues. Right now, there is that task force looking at compensation for pharmacists going on. So I'll be excited to see what happens within that task force. Is that going to be an automatic decrease to lower cost of drugs for seniors? No, that's going to be the part that opens access. But if you don't keep access open, then this is one of the things I really want to stress. As we look at, let's just say we look at health insurers in Connecticut, we have 3 providers right now. How do you have lots of competition with only 3 providers? I mean, you look at states like Tennessee, and they have, half a dozen to a dozen providers, and we only have 3. And let's say you keep squeezing healthcare along the way, and you squeeze pharmacists out. How many pharmacies are we going to end up with in the state of Connecticut? We need to make sure that we have the competition, because we don't want them to squeeze out of the market. Same with healthcare providers, same with health insurance. We need competition here, and we've got to find ways to open Connecticut up. Whether it is our high regulatory framework within government, or whether it's our cost of living here, this is not just about the cost of one drug.
Thank you. And it definitely, I feel like this legislation this year helped, move the ball forward, but it's not the end game. We have so much more to continue working on to make sure that prescription drug costs go down for everyone, and that everyone has access to the healthcare that they need. So thank you so much for your work on this issue and for joining us today to talk about this. There's certainly so much to talk about in the legislation, so many different components to the bill, and so much more for us to continue doing. So thank you, Margaret, for joining us as well. And thank you to all of our listeners for joining us for another episode of Coffee and Tea with AARP. So make sure to join us again in 2 weeks, and make sure to catch our back episodes if you missed them on YouTube or Facebook. Lastly, don't forget to scan this QR code on your screen to learn more about becoming an e-advocate and help us advance policies like the one we talked about here today, and other policies important to the 50 plus in Connecticut. So thank you.